Welcome to another episode from Personalized Exercise Programming. Our last two episodes that I put up were getting a little more business oriented to what I stand for in my mission, but an old friend out on the professional golf tour reached out through Facebook and was interested in some hip flexor information, which was a really good topic, even for myself, something I've been kind of back and forth with over the years of hips get tight, what should I do? Love strength training and running, so those are two things that can make the hips tight. And just like everybody, if I would rather work out and then stretch. So getting into it today, we will kind of discuss the muscles involved in hip flexors and some of the stuff that we're going to look at. But if you want to just skip forward to what to do and get the exercises, please feel free to. So for this video, we're really going to just talk about the muscles, the larger muscles around the hip that have this specific muscle action of hip flexion. So hip flexion is like standing up and touching your toes. That's hip flexion, or standing tall and then bringing your knee to your chest. That's another form of hip flexion. And typically when we think of hip flexors, we think of the iliopsoas, which is two muscles of the iliacus and the psoas major, which prime movers are of hip flexion. The iliacus also kind of rotates the femur medially, so towards the inside. But there's other hip flexors. Sometimes you'll see like 9. But one of those muscles don't typically, they're just assisted. It's not a prime mover of hip flexion. So we also have the sartorius, the tensor fasciae latae, the rectus femoris, adductor longus, gracilis, and pinnucus. So we have 3 adductors along with 2 knee extenders that also flex the hips. So now we got a total of 8 muscles, not 2 we got to think about. So when we look at that in movements, we have to think about, okay, so we have 5 that also rotate the femur towards the inside. We have 2 that rotate the femur towards the outside. We also have 2 that extend the knee. So when we're thinking about lengthening our hip flexor, we also have to think about, okay, we need to lengthen our internal rotation, part of our external rotation, and some of our knee flexors. So the rectus femoris, an example, your quadricep, one of the quadriceps. So going further, I'm going to show you a little test you can do at home, and we're going to kind of see, is it something I really need to focus on, or is there some movement imbalances along with the lengthening exercises, so the stretches and the mobility stuff. We're going to also talk about the exercises that we need to strengthen that typically aren't really working the way they should because our hip flexors are too tight. So typically when we have tight hip flexors, we'll go into what we call anterior pelvic tilt, so our hips are kind of rotated forward. And what that will do is take our glutes and kind of turn them off so they're not working properly. At the same time, our lower abs aren't going to be firing the way that we want them to. So what we need to do along with lengthening our hip flexors, we also need to reteach the glutes and the lower abs and the rectus abdominis that, hey, we gotta get turned back on. That way you can stabilize the hips in movement patterns and keep the hip flexors from overworking and the glutes working properly. So before we go into the exercise stuff, we kind of want to talk about mobility and flexibility training in the standpoint of trying to correct as corrective exercises in a sense. Stretching isn't really that fun. That's why a lot of us skip it, and it is uncomfortable. And we want it to be uncomfortable. So you know that old saying, no pain, no gain. That really only applies when we're doing any type of stretching. To lengthen the muscle, we do need to be at an uncomfortable state. Now, from my experience, my personal experience, and my professional experience, typically when we're doing something to lengthen muscles to help correct, it takes time. It takes quite a bit of time. When I herniated a disc almost 2 years ago, it took me almost 3 months of consistent work every day before my back felt better. Now, I had the time to do it. It only took me 30 minutes a day, but I was consistent. But it got to the point, and this is where it's kind of funny, I got to the point where I was ready to give up, and then it worked. So if you're in this rehab or you're trying to do something to lengthen muscles to feel better, you're going to face the same thing. You're going to get to the point where like, gosh, it's not working, you know, but stick with it. I promise you, if you stay with the routine or you stay with the air exercises or stay with the therapy for whatever you're doing, you're going to eventually achieve what you want to. Okay, so a test that I do, and then you can do it at home too to kind of monitor your length of your hip flexors, is a drop test. So don't need a massage table. You can use a coffee table or a sturdy kitchen table. You know, you are laying on it, so don't try to use anything that's gonna break. So what we're gonna do is kind of sit on the very edge like we're almost gonna fall off. Then we're gonna lean back, and when we do that, we're gonna bring both legs with us. And we're going to hug one leg to the chest and let the other one fall to the ground to see if our leg is going to touch the table. Now, I've been sitting all day, so it's probably going to be very noticeable that I have tight hips. So we're going to let the other one fall. And then we're going to keep this one tight. That's going to stabilize the pelvis. And what we're looking is, you can kind of see I have a little bit of an angle up, and my back of my leg doesn't really hit. Now, I do have a pretty big butt, so it's not going to be flush, but I'd rather see that this is aligned with my hip. But since I have been sitting all day, I'm kind of tight, this is a little bit elevated, and ideally we want to kind of bring it down. And you want to do that both sides, because you might see one leg tighter than the other. Now if you notice, if your right leg is a lot lower than your left, then you're in a compensation pattern, and you really want to hit home or lengthen those to an optimal length for both of them before you do any kind of really strenuous activity, because you could lead into an injury because you're already off balance in your hips. All right, so I said earlier, for the hip flexors, we also need to work on internal and external rotation and knee flexion as well. So we're going to work on the adductors along with the hip flexors, which are run through the gut, so they attach actually to the lumbar, and they run through and to the greater trochanter of your femur. At the same time, we also want to strengthen the opposing muscle groups to help keep things in alignment once we're there. So we'll start with the traditional kneeling hip flexor. So kneeling hip flexor, we're going to start with our knee under hips. And then from here, so this is the one that we typically know. One thing I want you to focus on, when we drive the hip forward into that stretch, you want to flex this glute. So if we flex this glute as we drive with our hips, it's going to help shut off the hip flexors. That's what has to work, so we can actually get a little more length. And we want to do that in like 8 to 10 reps. And on that 8th to 10th one, we're going to hold for 15 to 30 seconds. We'll stay nice and tall. So pigeon. You see that a lot in yoga, but today we're going to do a little different than coming through into the down dog that you typically see. I kind of want to start on this side, and from here we're going to move this leg out. Now the further your leg comes to 90 degrees, the more intense the stretch will be, and being here already, I can already feel the stretch. So bring this back a little bit, I straighten out this leg as much as possible, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll my hips forward into the stretch. Now I should get a stretch in my left glute, but since my adductors are really tight, I'm actually going to feel my adductors and my hip flexors in the back leg more than I will my front, and that's okay too. So again, we're going to roll the hip forward and then back in. Again, we're going to hold that or do that for 8 to 10 reps, and then after that 10th one, we'll come in and we'll hold. And you can collapse, or you can stay. I like to stay tall. I feel that hip flex a little more. As you see, my hips aren't on the ground, my legs are here. Now, as you do more stretches, the length will go, because you want to do 2 to 3 sets if we're really trying to open up the hips. So 2 to 3 sets, and by that 3rd set, you're going to notice you're further into that stretch. All right, so next we'll go into the kneeling quad stretch. It looks very similar to the kneeling hip flexor, where we'll start in half kneeling here. And you're going to reach back and you're going to grab this back leg. So our quad attaches above our hip and below our knee. So when we're here, this might be enough stretch for you, you can stay there. But if we want a little more and we add that repetition, you're gonna drive the hip forward. Again, 8 to 10 reps, hold for that 15 to 30 seconds. So next we'll go to frog. Frog is a inner thigh for more of a long adductor stretch. A couple ways we can do this, but we're really going to lay flat on the ground and we're going to put our inner knees and our inner shoes onto the ground, and then we're going to sit back into it with our elbows. I'll show you guys a couple views. So again, we're going to lie flat, and then we're going to put our inner legs on the ground. Now, a couple things we can notice is if the further my feet are out, the more intense. So if I need less intense and want to get more range of motion, I'm moving my feet in, or I can go up to the toe. And then from here, I'm going to sit back. Now, if I see how far I can come back from this position, I'm going to go a little wider, a little more feet on the ground, and I might not be able to get as far. And hold here. Now, during the hold, you can bring up to what we really see in yoga, kind of frog position. But if you do that, you want to make sure your tailbone stays tucked under and not out to the side or up to the sky. All right, so quadruped. So if you remember, as I said earlier, we also want to work on our external rotators. So to do that, we need to internally rotate the foot. So we're going to go into quadruped glute stretch, and we can also incorporate the adductors as well. So quadruped is knees under hips, shoulders under hands. And then for this stretch, we're going to straighten out the right leg, or we'll do both sides. You're going to read that shoe over to where the right knee was, or close. You're going to do a slight cross step. From there, you're going to sit back into the hip. And then once you feel that stretch in that left glute, you're going to drop down to your elbows, and that should be a little tense. Now you can relax all the way down, and you're going to repeat. Alright, so next let's go into seated internal rotation. Kind of like when we started in Pigeon, we'll be in this position. Instead of bringing our leg out here, we're going to bring it nice and close. And we're going to come nice and tall, so our spine isn't flexed too much, more of a tall. And what we're going to do from this leg here, this is where we're going to be our stretching the leg. So for me, it's my right leg. I want to bring my hips forward, so it's in neutral hip. And then I want to try to sit that cheek onto the ground. Now what we can do to release some of the stretch is bring this foot a little bit further, and I might get there, right? And I'm bring that back forward. I'm gonna bring it back down. And so our hip is doing this rotation, our femur are doing this rotation to our hip socket. You can, if you want to, raise a little toe action to get a little more at the bottom end. And then you're gonna hold that. Now if you have pretty flexible hips, mine are pretty tight usually, if you're able to get that cheek on, you want to bring this leg all the way up into almost into a seated position. Now some people, you'll see both legs that way, and that's great. Then that's not the area you need to focus on. You need to focus on the opposite area. So another one for hip external rotation is your traditional seated butterfly. We want to sit tall onto our sit bone, nice long spine. You can't push your hands behind to sit tall. And then you're going to press your thighs down. And you're going to do that for like 8 reps. And then if you need more stretch out of it, you can actually press one side down, hold that for 15 to 30. You can also, from this, you can go along seated. So as you find that stretch, you kind of lean back, roll the hips forward, and hold strong. So another hip external rotator. Oh, I'm sorry, buddy. Another hip external rotator across legs, same thing, or press away. We do that for 8 to 10. And then if, at the end, you're gonna kind of do a slight crunch and press that leg. So let's talk about the exercises that we want to strengthen. So we want to strengthen our rectus abdominis, our abs, and we want to strengthen the glutes. So when we talked about earlier anterior pelvic tilt, your pelvis can rotate forward. And when that happens, your hip flexors are really turned on, they're short. Doesn't mean they're strong, it just means they're short, and we want to lengthen those guys. And in order to keep our hips in a neutral position after we lengthen those, we want to strengthen the glutes and the abs. So we're going to go over forearm planks, dead bugs, so those are two of the rectus abdominis that we can work on. And then for our glutes, we're going to go over static bridges and single leg bridges. So for the forearm plank, as you see in other videos, you guys remember we're going to twist the pelvis slightly, so we tuck the tailbone under and we're lower our shoulders. Let's see if I can tuck my shirt in a little bit more. So elbows on the shoulders, we're bringing here, hips a little high. We're going to rotate the hips slightly. You should feel your lower abs engage. And you slowly and slightly lower the shoulders. Your goal here is for about 1 minute. Now for the dead bugs, if you have a ball, it's really easy to do with a ball, but I'll demo today without one just in case you don't have an exercise ball at home. So dead bug, we'll lie on our back, we're bringing the knees above our hips, and then what we're going to do is kind of press opposite. So we're here because we're going to move the opposite out, but the focus is when we're doing that, we press firmly into our legs, so our low abs fire, and we don't let those hips rock when we reach out. So we're going to stabilize the spine, we're going to cross step here, we're going to press firmly into one side, we're going to slowly reach the other side out, and we're going to come back in. And while I'm doing that, I'm really pressing firmly into my hand so that low abs stay nice and tight. And might even feel that in your low back, and that's fine, because those little muscles are going to need to stabilize the spine as we keep the abs tight. Alright, so static refers to just holding. From here, so static bridge, let the hips hold, squeeze the glutes if you need to, let the legs fall out to the side. If you feel your quads, raise your toe. And then really think about squeezing those glutes. And then for the single leg bridge, we're going to do similar to that drop test. We're going to hold one leg to the chest, and that's going to isolate the glute and make it do most of the work instead of allowing the assisted muscle groups of our erectors and stuff to help with the hip extension. So another one for hip external rotation, just your traditional seated butterfly. But we can also lean back into a long seated so you'll feel, but what we want to do is like push down the legs, right, and here with our glute muscles. And then if we need more stretch, we can sit tall and press down. That's good, buddy, I need you to have a shot. So another sit. Come on, man. I need you to come over. Good. Lay down. Sit. Sit. Lay down. There you go, boy. Oh, thank you. Lay down. Lay down. No, I don't want to play patty cake. Lay down. Come on. Lay down.